Welcome back to the Lights Out Podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls around the world. Good evening, boys and girls. Are you ready for bed? Are you all snuggled up and ready for another Lights Out bedtime story? Good, because you're in for a treat tonight. That's right. In tribute to the creator of Little Miss books and Mr. Men books, Roger Hargreaves, we have a series of 24 stories in 24 hours to make sure that wherever in the world you are, whatever time you go to bed, you have a Mr. Men book to listen to tonight. Book 12 of 24, Mr. Small by Roger Hargreaves, one of my favorite Mr. Men stories. Once upon a time, Mr. Small was very small, probably the smallest person you've ever seen in your whole life, or perhaps the smallest person you've never seen in your whole life, because he was so small you probably wouldn't see him anyway. Mr. Small was about as big as a pin, which isn't very big at all. So, perhaps we should say that Mr. Small was as small as a pin. Mr. Small lived in a small house underneath a daisy at the bottom of Mr. Robinson's garden. It was a very nice house, although very tiny, and it suited Mr. Small very well indeed. He liked living there. Now, this story is about the time Mr. Small decided to get a job. The trouble was, what sort of job could Mr. Small do? After all, there aren't that many small jobs. Mr. Small had thought about it for a long time, but hadn't had any ideas. Not one. He was thinking about it now, while he was having lunch. He was having half a pea, 1 crumb, and a drop of lemonade. Mr. Small thought and thought and thought while he was eating his big lunch, but it was no use. Thinking just made him thirsty, so he had another drop of lemonade. I know, he thought to himself. After lunch, I'll go and see Mr. Robinson and ask for his advice. So after lunch, he left his house and walked to Mr. Robinson's house at the top of the garden. It was quite a long walk for somebody as small as Mr. Small, and halfway there he stopped for a rest. He sat on a pebble, feeling quite out of breath. A worm crawled by and stopped. "Good afternoon, Mr. Small," said the worm. "Oh, good afternoon, Walter," said Mr. Small to the worm, who he knew quite well. "Out for a walk, are you?" asked Walter. "I'm going to see Mr. Robinson," replied Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter. "About a job," added Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter the worm again, and crawled off. Walter was a worm of very few words. After he'd rested for a while, Mr. Small set off again and walked all of the rest of the way to Mr. Robinson's house without stopping once. When he got there, he climbed up the steps to Mr. Robinson's back door. He knocked at the door. Nobody heard him. He knocked again at the door, and nobody heard him. And the trouble was, you see, that if you were as small as Mr. Small, you don't have a very loud knock. Mr. Small looked up. There, high above his head, was a doorbell. "How can I ring that bell when I can't even reach it?" thought Mr. Small to himself. And so he started to climb up the wall brick by brick to reach the bell. He had climbed up 4 bricks when he made a mistake of looking down. "Oh dear," he said, and fell. Bang! "Ouch!" said Mr. Small, rubbing his head. Just then, Mr. Small heard footsteps, and it was a postman. The postman came to the door, posted his letters, and was just about to leave when he heard a voice. "Hello," said the voice, and the postman looked down. "Hello," said the policeman to Mr. Small. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Small," said Mr. Small. "Will you ring the bell for me?" "Of course I will," replied the postman in answer to Mr. Small's question, and reaching out, he pressed the bell with his finger. "Oh, thank you," said Mr. Small. "My pleasure," said the postman, and off he went. Mr. Small heard the footsteps coming to the door. The door opened. Mr. Robinson opened the door and looked out. "Oh, that's funny," he said. "I'm not sure I heard somebody ring the bell." And he was about to shut the door when he heard a little voice. "Hello," said the voice. "Hello, Mr. Robinson." Mr. Robinson looked down and down. "Hello," he said with a loud, thundering voice. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to ask you advice," said Mr. Small to Mr. Robinson. "Well," said Mr. Robinson, "you better come in then and have a talk." Mr. Small followed Mr. Robinson into the house and, perched on the arm of Mr. Robinson's favourite chair, he told him how he couldn't think of a job that he could do. Mr. Robinson sipped a cup of tea and listened. "You see," said Mr. Small, explaining how difficult it is. "Oh yes, I could see that," said Mr. Robinson, "but leave it to me." And Mr. Robinson knew a lot of people. Mr. Robinson knew someone who worked in a restaurant and arranged Mr. Small to work there, putting mustard into mustard pots. But Mr. Small kept falling into the mustard pots and got covered in mustard. So he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a sweet shop and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, serving sweets. But Mr. Small kept falling into the sweet jar, so he left that job. The next day, Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a place where they made matches and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, packing matches into boxes of all things. But Mr. Small kept getting shut in the boxes with the matches, so he left that job too. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked on a farm, and he arranged for Mr. Small to work there, sorting the brown eggs from the white eggs. But Mr. Small kept getting trapped by the eggs, so he left that job. "What are we going to do with you?" Mr. Robinson asked Mr. Small one evening. "I don't know," said Mr. Small in a small voice. "I've got one more idea." And so the following day, Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's books. "Can I work for you?" asked Mr. Small. Yes, you can," replied the man. "Pass me that pencil and tell me all about the jobs you've been doing. Then I'll write a book about it and call it Mr. Small," he added. "But children won't want to read a book all about me," exclaimed Mr. Small. "Oh, yes, they will," replied the man. "They'll like it very much." The end of Mr. Small by Roger Hargreaves, here on the Lights Out podcast, bedtime stories for boys and girls around the world. Good night.